Danielle, I believe you're muted.
Good afternoon and welcome to the NARUC Financial Toolbox webinar on electrification, hosted by the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, with thanks to the U.S. Department of Energy for its support of this resource series. Next slide. The National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners is a nonprofit organization that supports the state utility regulatory commissions in all 50 states and territories. Our members regulate the electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities that are investor-owned in each state and territory. Next slide. My name is Danielle Sass-Burnett. I'm the director of the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. We are a grant-funded team that's dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members, both commissioners and commission staff, across the country. We are focused on identifying emerging challenges and connecting state commissions with expertise and strategies to inform their complex decision-making. We do this through providing trainings, research and publications, and offering events like this, in addition to in-person events. And you can find out more about us on the NARUC website. So today's event is part of the Financial Toolbox, Regulators Financial Toolbox series, which examines utility regulatory models for adopting innovative technologies. We host webinars and write plain language summary briefs that include resources for more detailed information in this series. And these resources are designed to help commissions across the engineering, accounting, and legal departments really understand how the functional needs of the grid could be supported with new technologies and investments paid for within the construct of regulatory law and accounting. You can find some past Financial Toolbox webinars on our website on resilience technologies, communications networks, AMI, or advanced metering infrastructure, and cloud computing. For this event, we are also recording, and we will post the presentation materials and recording within about a week. And we will be preparing a summary brief that will be available later this summer. So I'm very happy to turn things over to our moderator today, Joan White from the Vermont Public Utility Commission. Joan is a hearing officer where she works with utilities and policymakers on complex energy transactions, regulatory and legislative affairs, and climate change policy. And she is going to introduce our panelists and moderate the question and answer period and provide some context setting for this very interesting and emerging issue around electrification. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And I really wanted to thank NARUC for the opportunity to cover this topic, because I think a lot of us in the PUC space have really been struggling with the transformation in the energy sector and how to take our old regulatory structures, specifically in kind of how we deal with finance in relation to utilities, and map onto that, the transformation of electrification and also kind of emerging technologies. And so this series, I think, is really critical, and it comes at a key time in our decarbonization. So I wanted to do a little bit of stage setting, which is just to say that I think there are many states around the country that have acknowledged that decarbonization, a critical part of decarbonization, is beneficial electrification. And so that means creating more transportation load that is electric, also creating more heating load that is electric. And it also means deep, deep energy efficiency. So I am very happy to introduce our first speakers. Oh, actually, I'll tell you a teeny bit about Vermont, because we've been on the leading edge of electrification with a policy that was passed by the legislature in 2015 and then implemented starting in 2017 for the DUs, our distribution utilities, to actually kind of provide upfront incentives to customers for technologies that electrify the grid. So that's mostly in transportation, heating, also weatherization. And we also have a standalone energy efficiency utility that's operating under a performance-based regulation plan that's been very, very effective in this space. So, so Vermont's a little ahead of the curve, and I can tell you we've experienced a lot of learning and bumps in the road, and it's not without its challenges. And one of those challenges is, how do we do the accounting? So some of our utilities are rate basing the investments they're making for electrification, and other utilities are running it through as an O&M expense. So I can talk more about that if people are interested, but another challenge is sort of how do you count and measure all these things and sort of give utilities credit for what they're doing. And then the last thing is it really just depends so much on what the policy and legislative context is in your state. And so having enabling legislation from our legislature has allowed us to kind of jump forward in this area. So, so I'm happy to touch on that more in depth in the Q&A, but that's all just to say that we're all learning in this space. And so I'm so excited to introduce our first speakers. So we've got two great speakers from ACEEE. The first is Edward Yim, and he's their utilities program. He's the director of their utility programs. And he's got a lot of deep experience in kind of energy decarbonizations, resilience planning, grid modernization, and sort of energy transition strategies. And he used to work at the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment. So he just brings a real well of experience. And also from ACEEE is Dan York. He's a senior fellow of utilities and local policy at ACEEE. And he's got about 20 years of experience, analyzing and researching energy efficiency implementation. So we've got some deep knowledge here. And I think what we'll do is the speakers are going to go for about 20 minutes, and then we'll save around 5 minutes at the end for just purely clarifying questions. And then at the end of all three presentations, we're going to have 15 to 20 minutes of substantive Q&A and back and forth. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Edward and Dan for their presentation.
Hey, thank you, Joan. My name is Edward Yin, and I lead ACEEE's State and Utility Policy team. And along with my colleague, Dan York, we really like to thank NARUC for organizing a webinar on this important topic. And we really appreciate your time in thinking about the issues that we'll cover. I'll spend just a few minutes to provide some background information on what is driving beneficial electrification and where we are seeing its implementation. Then I'll hand it over to Dan, who will share some of our key findings on building electrification programs in various jurisdictions that we're seeing. Next slide, please. I'll begin by describing what we mean by beneficial electrification at ACEEE. Electrification simply refers to switching from fossil fuel to electricity for end-use appliances. And beneficial electrification refers to the type of electrification that leads to societal benefits, such as greenhouse gas reductions and lower costs. And to the extent that electric appliances like energy efficient heat pumps and fuel efficient EVs tend to reduce primary energy use, we would consider such electrification to be beneficial and a form of energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So the main policy driver of beneficial electrification comes from the push to decarbonize the energy system. So climate scientists who have been working to identify how to reduce greenhouse gas reductions, or reduce greenhouse gas emissions rather, to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. They've identified beneficial electrification as one of the top strategies for achieving that goal. So you'll see it prominently featured in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that are very influential, for all of the countries, as well as other influential decarbonization reports, such as the US Deep Decarbonization Pathway Project. So a typical climate action strategy consists of first reducing your energy demand through efficiency, then both decarbonizing electricity and electrifying end-use appliances. And you will find some version of that formula in most climate action plans and related energy plans. The top graph is from the US Deep Decarbonization Pathway Project report, which shows the expected greenhouse gas savings from certain policy actions. The largest one being decarbonized electricity, and the second largest being fuel switching and electrification. Excuse me. Next slide, please. And this electrification push also has a timing component. You might already be hearing from some advocates in your respective jurisdictions with a particular sense of urgency for electrification. And this urgency really may be explained by the fact that because heat pumps and water heaters last a good number of years, we really only have a couple of opportunities to change them before the target year of 2050. But the same goes for vehicles. And for grid capacity build out in buildings, the urgency is even greater because we really just have one chance at replacing those. Next slide, please. And what about the cost of electrification? A lower cost overall is a component of beneficial electrification. And climate researchers indeed find that having a high rate of electrification is likely to be less costly overall than having a low rate of electrification for meeting the greenhouse gas target. The graph that you're seeing is from the Net Zero America 2050 study that was published a couple of years ago out of Princeton. And it shows that high electrification results in a lower overall electricity demand than low electrification. Now, I understand that that result appears counterintuitive, but the finding is that the low electrification scenario, which involves making hydrogen and synthetic methane out of electricity, would require a very large amount of electricity, resulting in a higher cost and a higher electrical system build out overall. Next slide. So where are we likely to see a push for electrification? Obviously, one strong indicator will be those states that have a climate action policy, whether it is embodied in a climate or energy plan or in an official document committing to a specific greenhouse gas reduction target. Generally, most climate plans use the 3 pillars of decarbonization that I just referred to, which again are efficiency, decarbonized electricity, and fuel switching, including electrification. But there may be a couple of exceptions. There are roughly more than 30 states with some type of climate action plan, although a few of those may be inactive or merely aspirational. Some examples may be in Kentucky or Arkansas. Let's see, next slide. So, but pushing for electrification is a separate issue from having the ground rules in place for electrification. When we look at where there are policies for fuel switching or electrification in the context of state climate policy, the picture gets fairly complicated. Some states that have climate policy have rules that support fuel switching, as Joan mentioned. Some states with climate policy do not yet have supportive fuel switching rules and may even have some old rules that discourage fuel switching in certain situations. There are a few states with climate policy, but without any specific fuel switching rules that nonetheless may still allow fuel switching on a case-by-case basis. So this map is taken from a draft report we're putting together on a survey of fuel switching policies in states. So this is still a draft and not final, but it just serves to illustrate some of that complexity of where we are. So right now, despite a push for decarbonization and electrification in many states, the existing rules on the ground are fragmented. And this fragmentation notwithstanding, we are seeing some sensible approaches to designing and implementing beneficial electrification programs. And with that, I'll just now turn it over to my colleague, Dan, who will discuss key aspects of those approaches.
All right, great. Thank you, Edward. And again, I thank Neeruk for this opportunity, and it's great to be talking about this important topic. So Edward gave a great background and context for why this is happening. I'm going to dig a little bit into where it's happening and how it's happening on couple recent research projects we did looking at electrification programs. So next slide, please. All right, so we start off with the foundation that we really see, no surprise as an energy efficiency organization, but the synergies of energy efficiency and electrification. That these are 3 kind of bedrocks where, first of all, the building shell and other efficiency measures reduce the loads, especially for space heating, which can reduce equipment sizing and costs. Essentially, we don't want to electrify inefficient loads. It just compounds and increases costs where they're not needed. So they go hand in hand. And then at the system level, as we electrify, that's going to be affecting load profiles, and some utilities may be switching more to a winter peak. At any rate, it's going to modify that so that by aggressive energy efficiency, you can keep that electricity demand in check and got to moderate that load growth and avoid some of those difficult to meet peaks. And then also with energy efficiency and demand response programs, which are more and more integral, things like smart thermostats and load control programs. That provides important opportunities for load flexibility, which is becoming especially important under electrification. Next slide, please. So our first research project was really a snapshot of so what's going on out there in the world. Where are some of these electrification programs happening? So this wasn't an exhaustive study that we went through every state plan and every utility to see what's offered, but we built on some earlier work. We had kind of knew where things are happening and checked in on that. So we identified 42 examples of programs that are working to electrify fossil fuels in buildings. And no surprise that the leading states were mostly those that set goals and mandates for building carbonization, really found on the coast and some in the Rockies and the Midwest. And there's go ahead for the next slide, but there are reports available, and when you get the slides, you can check those out. So quick summary. So of these 42 programs, 90% of them offered some kind of incentives for electrified space heating, clearly essentially heat pumps. And then breaking that down a little bit, of those offering some kind of incentives for electrifying space heating, half of the 42 programs or utility programs offered it for ductless air source heat pumps, the ductless mini splits, some ground source heat pumps at about a fifth of the total, ducted air source heat pumps smaller, and then cold climate air source heat pumps, which are especially important in places like Vermont and Wisconsin where I live, a smaller amount. They're emerging on the market, but are proving themselves. All right, water heating, 71% of those 42 programs offer water heating, smaller number for cooking, the induction stoves, and then a few other distributed energy resources thrown in: solar, electric vehicles, and batteries. All right, so next one, and the building types, mostly towards single family residential. About half of them offer something for multifamily residential, and then roughly a fourth of them offer something for the commercial buildings. Next slide. So quickly, key findings, and we're going to move right along here. So electrification in buildings is growing compared to the work we did a few years earlier. Found that $166 million in program spending, which is still a fraction of the I don't know, 8 or 10 billion that's spent on efficiency programs. But again, it wasn't a comprehensive tally of everything out there. But space heating with heat pumps was most frequently targeted end use for incentives. And most of these programs focused on rebates to end users. There may be other ways that to reach and provide incentives to customers or their suppliers that could be more effective, but essentially the program model is to provide that incentive to cover the extra incremental cost of going to heat pumps. Next slide, please. Again, just got to circle back to the importance of pairing these electrification measures with weatherization and noting that conventional energy efficiency is really important to maximize impact. And so programs that may be offering kind of a full slate of energy efficiency incentives are expanding that portfolio to include some to incentivize electric technologies to replace those fossil fuel ones in the homes and buildings. And this no news probably that low and moderate income customers face additional barriers to electrification that programs need to work harder to overcome. And the second research project I'll be talking about in a moment goes into that a little in more detail. And then contractors are clearly a key in all of this. The HVAC folks who come out and service and replace equipment, their support is critical to get this moving. And I think in many markets, we're finding that kind of resistance. Here in Wisconsin, natural gas furnaces have ruled, and heat pumps, there's still a lot of apprehension among customers and just lack of awareness. and that, you know, contractors also, they want to please their customers. They don't want callbacks and people complaining. So still a lot of work to do there. Next one. So just a quick list of recommendations by different actors in the markets. State legislatures and governments can set those targets, as Edward covered, provide some funding for programs, especially for those hard to reach sectors, work on strengthening building codes to incorporate electrification, and then this workforce training and incentives to move the market. For regulators, all of you, removing those barriers to the fuel switching and including and valuing climate and greenhouse gas impacts and cost effectiveness screening. So more things will pencil out and can be included. Utilities, just expanding those program offerings, phasing out incentives for fossil fuels. Contractors, again, that's just the training and education for them. And property owners and homeowners, just be planning ahead. I know in my own case, my natural gas furnace is probably nearing the end of its life, so I'm starting to investigate my options and be ready for that. And again, energy efficiency rules. Okay, next one, please. So energy equity. I'm going to be wrapping up my talk here with just some work we did looking at decarbonization for affordable housing. And there's the barriers that are especially pronounced in trying to reach and serve these customers. Access to funding and financing is by far number one. Just paying incentives to people who don't have enough money to invest in their home, or property owners who don't see the payoff, that is a very big deal. And for renters, the split incentive is a big problem. Higher electricity costs in multifamily, if you're going from a master metered heat supplied and included in rent, and now you're switching out to some kind of heat pumps in individual units, all of a sudden you potentially shift costs to those renters who normally weren't paying that. And just the disruption with multi-unit dwellings, and again, circling back to the moving the contractor market and getting them comfortable and experienced with doing this work. So what we found was essentially this is really at an early stage. We didn't really find that many examples of utility programs serving low and moderate income customers. And what we did really uncover is that there's a lot of efforts at federal, state, and local levels that are kind of supplementing or doing it on their own. So next slide, please. And so just a couple examples of federal efforts. Won't go to detail here. You can circle back to these later. But at the federal level, that the LIHTC, the credits have been used for a long time to improve housing, mostly with a focus on energy efficiency. But there's nothing necessarily holding that back from investing that in adding electrification. And states might supplement that federal credits of their own. And then the WAP programs, weatherization assistance, again, focused has been energy efficiency, but just through the infrastructure package that was passed, there's going to be a $3+ billion in additional funding to be targeted towards energy efficiency and electrification. So that could be a big push. So stay tuned on that one. Next one, please. Some state programs. California, like in many areas, has kind of taken one of the early leads among states and establishing and targeting programs specifically for low moderate income customers. See some of the, so they've got various efforts going on that are electrifying targeted communities. And New York, similarly, a lot of multifamily housing in New York City, and so they're looking at leveraging public funding to go after large commercial multi-family building retrofits, developing a cohort challenge there to again target some of the large multi-family buildings, and some pilots. Let's go on to the next one, please. Try to wrap up here. And the few utility program examples, here's a Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which has very aggressive carbon reduction goals, be carbon free by 2030. So it's kind of an all hands on deck approach, not leaving the LMI sector behind. So they're looking, I think this point here is really important, that they're established partnerships with various community organizations to serve these customers, Habitat for Humanity and some local community-based organizations. So, and the funding organizations that can leverage all available sources to get this done. And so they are going after some low-income electrification, multifamily, and also new homes. And haven't mentioned that explicitly yet, but new homes is one of those areas where there can be a really no cost premium for going electric with heat pumps from the get-go. There's some cost savings that offset other things. So next one. And then this one in DC, operated by DC Sustainable Energy Utility, very small pilot. It got interrupted a bit by the pandemic, but they just with this small pilot, they've had good results and they plan on expanding it. Next one. Just a couple local program examples. Minneapolis, again, addressing both preservation of the unsubsidizable affordable housing, and decarbonization was specific goals, but again, they could marry those goals with some of the other things they're doing. And Boston has an aggressive program out there, $30 million to targeted toward affordable housing to support the rehab and electrification. All right, so wrapping up here, keys to success. Again, this is very early in the going. I'm sure we're going to be learning a lot more, and really encourage commissions to support their utilities in this work. Tying it to specific carbon reduction goals, the securing adequate funding and financing is again a real key to possibly braid funding together, leverage federal, state, utility dollars, local programs, establishing collaborations among those affordable housing stakeholders, figure out what's needed, engage the customers, the households you're working with, engaging with the affordable housing residents, and then educating residents, building owners, contractors, and suppliers. For a lot of people, this is going to seem very different than turning on a gas stove and or firing up the natural gas furnace. They operate somewhat differently, and it takes some adjustment, but there are certainly many health, safety, and cost benefits in addition to the carbon reductions. Next one, please. So that wraps up our portion, and thanks for your attention. Look forward to this follow-up discussion, and again, feel free to follow up after the webinar with Edward or me. We'll be very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward and Dan. It's just so great to get that national overview and kind of see where folks are at. We do have time for one question now, and so it's from Rodney Sobin, and it's in the chat. And he's really asking, did any of the programs you looked at give either an extra incentive or require enrollment in kind of an active demand response program? So I know, I'll just say in Vermont, we do have our biggest utility. If you receive an upfront incentive for an EV or an EV charger, you're required to enroll in either a time-based rate or an active demand response rate. So we have some rate setting practices around that, but I'd love to hear what Dan and Edward have to say on that question.
Offhand, I wasn't involved in the weeds of this research project. I can't answer that directly, but Rodney, I'll check on that with Charlotte and Nora, who did the deep dive on this work. I'm kind of presenting the summary, but I think, Joan, as you noted, I think that's very likely tied into some of that utilities are recognizing the value of that kind of integration of demand response with electrified technologies, or at least making them demand response ready, so that they as rates and other programs develop, that can be linked there.
I've certainly seen proposals. I'm not immediately aware of many approved programs that heat pumps have to be enrolled in a DR program as well, using the two-way, the functionality for demand flexibility. But that obviously is a good idea that we would support.
Great. So I think that covers that question. And I think we're all struggling with that a little bit, especially the technological aspect. How do you establish kind of standardized two-way communications protocols? We've had a few pilot programs that then the provider of the technology goes out of business 2 years later, and the field is just still evolving. So it's a tricky space. Great. So I don't see any other questions right now, but just a reminder, if you have questions, you can pop them into the chat or the Q&A, and we will, we'll track those as we go and jot things down. We'll have some time at the end for questions. So we are going to jump to our next speaker. Mark Schoenheider. He leads the residential and small and medium business customer solutions organization for Xcel Energy. And one really interesting thing about Mark is that he works with both natural gas and electric customers, kind of working on decarbonization and clean energy transition. So I think we often talk about electric, and natural gas gets a little bit left behind. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark to give us a little more of that utility perspective.
Great, thanks, Joan. I appreciate the time here. I'm going to kind of go, what my goal here is to really set the stage for questions and for a discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of Xcel and where we're at, as well as then focus in on Colorado and the journey that we are on in Colorado, which is one of our states. And then talk a little bit more specifically about some of our beneficial electrification offerings, and then tease at the end with a little bit of some of the results from our actual programs in the field. So if you want to jump to the next slide. At a super high level, Xcel Energy, for those of you that aren't aware, we're electric and gas utility. We have electric customers in 8 states and gas customers in 5 of those states. The sort of largest two from a customer segment, and where we're both a gas and electric utility for many of our customers, are Minnesota and Colorado. You want to jump to the next slide? I'm going to focus. This is at a super high level for us as a company. You see our vision and our mission on the left, and then our strategic priorities on the right. I couldn't have written these better if I wrote them for my organization, and these are for our entire company, right? So lead the clean energy transition, enhance customer experience, and keep bills low. And within leading the clean energy transition, we were the first major utility in the US to put a goal out there to be 100% carbon-free electricity by 2015. Roughly a year after that, we put forward a goal to have 1.5 million EVs on the road in our territory. And then we followed that up in early 2021 on the natural gas side of having a goal of a 25% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 from our gas operations, and then to be a net zero natural gas utility by 2050, which was a bit of a shock. We had, as a combined electric and natural gas utility, frankly, there are people that we've been running a natural gas utility for 150 years. And that's a very foreign concept to a lot of our core business. However, if we jump to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the details there and why. If we break down, this doesn't mean that goal of being a net zero natural gas utility does not mean that we're getting rid of the gas system. The natural gas system provides a safe, reliable, low-cost way to keep our customers, healthy and safe. It does, however, mean a significant reduction in the amount of gas that we flow through the system, and for the rest of the gas, it means a change in the molecules. And so we've broken it down into a 2030 goal, which is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 25% below 2020 levels, but also addressing some of the sort of more upfront utility side stuff, like net zero methane emissions, and exclusively purchasing certified natural gas for our distribution and power generation. That's the intermediate goal, and the long-term goal is by 2050 deliver gas service to our customers with net zero emissions. If we jump to the next slide, there is no single silver bullet to decarbonizing either the building sector or a gas utility. We have identified many different opportunities. Frankly, we don't know how much each of these utilities will contribute to that overall solution. We do know that for many, if not all of these, there are quite a few no regret activities that we can and need to be taking immediately to learn more and develop and figure out how all these pieces will come together. And I think that's one of the key takeaways that I'd like to bring to this audience is there are compromises and there are challenges and there are trade-offs with every single one of these opportunities. And the right solution, when you go back to our strategic priorities of enhancing the customer experience, leading the clean energy transition, and keeping bills low, when you balance and when you look at all three of those, you need a balanced approach. And I appreciated the slide earlier where you had this bubble of electrification and then a smaller bubble of beneficial electrification. All electrification is not necessarily beneficial electrification. And, if we think about not just, us as a utility, us as states, but as our customers and as an entire economy, there are a limited number of resources we have to devote to everything we do in life. And if we can reduce the environmental impact of what we do and do that with spending the fewest of resources as possible to do that, that benefits everybody. And so I would encourage an open mind and an understanding of how all of those relate together. So if we jump to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit focusing in now on Colorado, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order. So we're going to talk through Colorado legislation and sort of where that's at, and then we're going to jump backwards in time a little bit to how we have included beneficial electrification into our existing energy efficiency portfolio. So in the Colorado 2021 legislative session, and for those of you not familiar with Colorado, this is sort of a beginning of the year, generally wraps up in early May. There were 3 bills that significantly impacted the sort of carbon future of our state and specifically impacted utility operations. The gas DSM bill, among other things, it really started to formalize how gas demand side management is overseen in Colorado. Historically, we as the gas utility would propose goals in a docket. There was no sort of outside overarching strategic issue structure, and I apologize for having an acronym SI in there without defining it. I'll talk about that a little bit later, about what the Colorado regulatory structure looks like. The second bill that was very impactful was the beneficial electrification bill. Among other things, it required us to, as a utility, and it required electric utilities to file beneficial electrification plans. It required the commission to set targets, and we were able to, as a utility, we thought it was important. The bill originally, as introduced, had the beneficial electrification plan separate from an energy efficiency or load management or demand side management plan. And as we'll talk about later, there are many, many reasons for, we believe, that those plans should be combined, because there's a ton of overlap, not only in the contractors that are putting in equipment, but in the actual equipment itself, as well as in the customers' minds of how this stuff works together. And so we are allowed to, and 3 more acronyms there, DSM is demand side management, BE is beneficial electrification, and TEP is our transportation electrification plan. And effectively, we have the flexibility to integrate those plans together within that legislation. The last bill on there is probably the most impactful from a number standpoint. It sets targets for greenhouse gas reduction in various years. And I will say, so this is a performance-based piece of legislation, whereas generally speaking, our demand side management programs are more of what I would consider a prescriptive approach, where you're incentivizing customers and you're tracking a reduction in either usage, either actual usage or potential usage compared to a baseline. Whereas the clean heat bill is a performance-based, and so it's almost as simple as look back to 2015. What was the total greenhouse gas emission from our distribution operations, as well as sourcing the gas and customers consuming the gas? Take 4% off of that, and that is your number for 2025. And so it doesn't, things like customer growth don't factor into it from the perspective of, even if we have significant customer growth, we still have to get to a total amount of greenhouse gas emissions below that 2015 number. And that you see there a further reduction down to 22% reduction by 2030. This is, it is that performance-based goal, but it is also technology agnostic. So it really, in my view, it's this sort of comprehensive legislation and comprehensive goal that assembles all the pieces, whether it's renewable natural gas, hydrogen, DSM, beneficial electrification, recovered methane. That we have existing programs and or pilots for all of those. This kind of adds it up and looks at it from that truly performance-based approach. Jump to the next slide. Okay, here's where I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about specifically demand side management history and framework. Xcel and PSCO, our operating company, Public Service of Colorado, has had demand side management in various forms on the electric side prior to 2009. But we in 2009, we did launch our gas demand side management portfolio, and we significantly expanded our electric portfolio. We have a little bit of a two-tiered framework for how our demand side management programs are regulated. We do what's called a strategic issues docket every 5 years, and that basically sets the rules of the road, the framework for how the programs will operate. It does, as I have listed there, it talks about and sets a cost effectiveness methodology, it sets budget caps, it sets goals, avoided cost methodologies, non-energy benefit methodologies. All of those sorts of things are defined in the strategic issues docket. It historically, prior to the gas DSM bill, which I talked about earlier, its primary focus was electric. And so we would have an electric, both spend cap and gigawatt hour goal, as well as a demand management KW or megawatt goal defined in strategic issues for the period. But we did not have gas goals set in there. The strategic issues docket also defines the company incentive mechanism, which is really a mechanism to offset potentially any lost revenues from energy efficiency programs, as well as provide a performance incentive for the company, so that that incentive tries to align what's good for customers with what's good for the company. In Colorado in particular, the current incentive mechanism is based on a percentage of societal net benefits. And so the higher the achievement, the higher the percentage of societal net benefits that the programs create, the company is entitled to a percentage of those. The 2012, 2017, 2022 are sort of the timeframes, the dates of those strategic issues filing. We have not yet filed the 2022 plan. It is strategic issues filing. It is, we are planning to put that in on July 1st, and it will look significantly different than past ones, primarily due to the legislation. What you'll notice, though, is when we filed our 21-22 DSM plan, which we're currently operating, it was under not only the old strategic issues methodology, but also we filed that in roughly April of 2020, which was before the legislation I talked about on the previous page. So all of that sets the stage for our biennial plans. And those are typically biennial, although we may do a one-year plan at the end of a strategic issues docket to kind of sync up the time frame there. And those biennial plans where strategic issues talked about all the rules and the framework, the biennial plan gets into what are the programs we're going to offer, what are the measures, what are the rebate levels, how are how is that overall budget allocated. It talks about all of that. And so you guys are probably fairly familiar with those types of plans. That's nothing very unique in Colorado. If you want to jump to the next slide, this is where things get a little out of order. When we're filing the 21-22 DSM plan, we, as a company, were aware and were in the process of developing our natural gas goal. And we knew that A, we needed to do more on the gas DSM side, and B, we knew that there were opportunities to allow beneficial electrification, and that we thought we needed to start to promote them in the market, start to educate contractors, start to educate customers, and really get the ball rolling. Unfortunately, there was a legal in statute, we were not allowed to do beneficial electrification. We're not allowed to do fuel switching. So on the graph earlier where you saw the states, and there were some that had, I believe it was like a white font with an orange crosshatch where fuel switching was prohibited. Colorado until 2021 was one of those. And so when we were filing our DSM plan in 2020, we had to get two waivers. One was to increase our gas DSM budget, and the previous cap was 15 million. We increased it to 18 million. And then the other waiver we had to get was to allow fuel switching. I'm going to talk a little bit on what we filed and what we intended, but I really want this to be a place where, as you guys have questions, ask them, because there's far too much to kind of go through randomly. So the beneficial electrification measures, we targeted to spend about $1 million on them in 2020 in 2021 and in 2022. We included heat pump water heaters, dual fuel air source heat pumps, all electric new construction. And then on our commercial side, we really didn't feel that there was yet enough certainty around the types of measures people would do, the types of equipment, how they would use that equipment. And so on the commercial side, we opened it up to our custom program where each individual project gets analyzed on its own. We did propose all of those under our gas DSM, the gas side of our DSM plan. And so they were funded from the gas customers. We also, if you're electrifying a space heating, for example, there's going to be a reduction in gas usage, but there will be a corresponding increase in electric consumption. And we did ask for, and stakeholders agree, that those added kilowatt hours should not count against our electric DSM goals. A lot of the methodology and concept there was our electric system as part of our corporate goals to being 80% carbon-free on electric side by 2030. We were already a little over half. And a lot of the times where you'll be electrifying in shoulder seasons, especially, already we're a very high percentage of renewables, specifically wind, for our system. The fourth bullet there under the BE measures is we did somewhat of a limited filing, and it's absolutely voluntary for customers because we were concerned about the bill impact, the ongoing bill impact for individual customers. We chose the measures where on average, customers would come out about even. So heat pump water heaters or a dual fuel air source heat pump, customers can effectively end up paying about the same using those measures as they would have with a gas alternative. But there are some customers that benefit from those, and there are some customers that even those measures will end up costing them more on their bill as they move forward. So, but we did, like I said, we needed to get a foothold and to start really educating customers, educating trade, getting equipment into the area learn along the way, so that as we, come into filing our first the first strategic issues docket that includes beneficial electrification, we're going to know a little more, know what works, know what doesn't work. The last 2 points there are hourly marginal energy prices. Effectively, we can't and we don't have visibility into what our hourly marginal carbon is on the system. So when I say marginal, I mean, if you were to add a kilowatt hour due to electrification, you're going to have to generate that somewhere. And what is that next piece of generation that either gets turned on, or if it's renewable and we were curtailing and you reduce that curtailing, obviously there's no carbon impact. But what we did find was using marginal energy prices as a surrogate for carbon was very, the two are very highly correlated, in that wind and solar have very, very low marginal energy costs. All upfront cost rather than an ongoing cost. And so those match the carbon intensity of those very well. And then the last one is in our previous strategic issues framework. It was from 2017. The cost of carbon was not included in the cost effectiveness methodology from either a performance incentive standpoint or the overall cost effectiveness test that every measure or every product and program are required to be reviewed under. However, in previous DSM cases, we had settled and agreed to include those. And so we are showing cost of carbon and cost of methane in the cost bends. However, it is not yet factored into or aligned with our incentive mechanism. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide, I want to give just a little bit of a sneak peek of how it's going. Our 21-22 plan, we did not settle it and get it implemented until April of 2021. So we had about 9 months last year, and things went pretty well. Overall, we had about 300 electrification rebates that were issued. This particular slide is, it's actually should say Colorado Q1 2022. Sorry, I mistyped that. This is from the first quarter of this year. And I tried to present here not just the number of units that were delivered that were rebated through the program, both broken out by what were fuel switching, so from gas to electric, as well as traditional electric to electric, but also compare that over on the right side to some of our traditional measures. And super high level, what you see is 150 electrification rebates, which is awesome from where we were, and it's kind of double the pace we were on last year if we think about it. But still, compared to the central air conditioners and the natural gas furnaces, we're still a very small portion of the portfolio, but small but growing, thankfully. I think that's my last slide, so I guess we can open up for any questions now and or in the discussion later. I think, Joan, you might be muted.
I so appreciate that. You would think after 2.5 years of pandemicing, we'd all be not doing that anymore. However, so I actually did have a question about the clean heat bill that you mentioned, SB 21-264. So, I mean, maybe this is just my New England hat that I'm wearing, but we recently had a clean heating bill that passed both houses, but then was vetoed by the governor and they couldn't overturn. And I think it was because the target of that legislation was our unregulated fuel sector. So we have a lot of, and they were going to have to help people do weatherization and replace, do heat pumps and whatever, like wood pellets and stuff. But the target was these unregulated fuel dealers who have never been inside the regulatory structure before, and they're delivering by truck liquid propane and also number 2 heating oil. And that's just a huge barrier that we're facing in New England. So I wondered if you had any insight into whether the Colorado Clean Heat Standard addressed only regulated fuels or whether unregulated was included.
Yeah, so Colorado, taking a step back, there is a carbon roadmap which addresses all the carbon in the entire state. So transportation, industry, as well as sort of the utility side of it. The clean heat bill that I'm referencing there is specific to regulated utilities. However, and I'll, full transparency, right? I think the this is where some of that common sense has to come in, because some of those things you were just talking about, like delivered propane and fuel oil, those are probably some of the not only most carbon intensive, but also from a customer standpoint, some of the most expensive current ways to heat your home. And therefore, from a customer adoption standpoint, a great place for electrification, right? And one of the challenges we have is the majority of customers in Colorado keep their homes with natural gas. And on a BTU basis, natural gas is incredibly cheap compared to electricity, or compared to propane, compared to fuel and whatnot. And so the probably the biggest barrier that we see to customer adoption is, and I'm gonna digress for a second. When we look at efficiency, right, we've had a hugely successful efficiency portfolio in all of our states for many years. And pretty much everything we offer, the customer gets a better quality of what they're putting in, and they save money. And with that money savings, it generally pays for itself in 3 to 5 years. What we're asking them to do with electrification, especially if you start with natural gas, it's likely a better quality of living, and it's great. It's a little different to them, so they have to get used to that. But, you know, the cases that we're talking about, a lot of them just break even on cost. Some of them are actually more expensive, and very few, if any, will, the way that utility rates are structured and that right now, they most of them won't pay for themselves. And so it's a very different paradigm. But getting back to your original question, if you're going after propane or delivered oil, you know, fuel on that, those generally cost more per BTU. And so it actually can be a very cost competitive option, and you know, it's an easier sell, so to speak. Oh, I do want to, if I can, just Rodney, going back to your question earlier, we do have, and we have in various parts of our electrification program, we do have requirements, or have had requirements for connected. We've tried a couple different approaches. One was by offering increased incentives, for example, for heat pump water heaters to have a CTA 2045 port. You know, we had another portion of it where we do actually have a demand response program to preheat water heaters up higher, have a mixing valve, you know, some great stuff. We have had to adapt some of those to the reality of the market. CTA 2045 chips were effectively not available for 18 months. You know, we have struggles with getting some of the equipment, and we're kind of in this dynamic, see what works. But at the end of the day, I would much rather have a dual fuel heat pump, so have that air conditioner, instead of a customer putting in an air conditioner, put in a heat pump and have it there. Even if we can't control it yet, the infrastructure is there, the equipment is there. So it's kind of been hit or miss. This is where those compromises kind of come in, because I think we all ideally say, yeah, you know, there's a ton of thermal storage available in a house, you know, both in just the conditioned space as well as the water heater. But practically, a lot of that equipment isn't necessarily available or always there. And I don't really want that to limit a customer adoption of an electrification technology. So it's definitely a balance.
Great response. And I think what we're going to do is, we had one more question for you, Mark, and I'm just going to go ahead and ask it now, because I don't know how much time we'll have at the end. And actually, I had the same question as one of our attendees. So for the measures that Xcel is implementing, are those generally being rate-based, or are you running them through O&M like the way that a lot of efficiency utilities will do?
That's a great question. I meant to address and I didn't. So our DSM programs, we have a rider on the bill, a DSMCA. It's concurrent recovery, you know, and so we put out our annual budget. You know, we look at how that tracker is going, and if there's extra or less. And then we set out to recover that entire program budget concurrently with spend, and our BE measures are currently within that context. You know, long term, I don't know if that's going to be. I mean, frankly, I don't know that we're going to be able to get the participation that we need in the program to hit some of those aggressive goals with that model. But that's currently how we're set up, and you know, we're kind of easing our toes into this, for lack of a better term. We did it prior to the legislation, and it's growing and it's building. I think that's something we'll have to look at, but currently it's all concurrent recovery.
Okay, that's super interesting. And in Vermont, we're doing a mix. Most of our munis and co-ops are doing concurrent recovery, and our biggest IOU is largely rate basing. And also our natural gas utility is rate basing. And one appeal of allowing rate basing of these investments is that it can smooth the rate impact. And because our decarbonization goals are time sensitive, you can actually front load a lot of your decarbonization efforts. And then that cost gets kind of smoothed over time. I mean, it's the downside is that then in addition to paying just the upfront cost, you're also paying the ROE on top of it. So it's more money over the long term, but you're getting the decarbonization benefits up front and you don't have rate shock. So
we've been having very similar conversations with stakeholders about what is and at the end of the day, I think the biggest difference between, decarbonization through beneficial electrification and efficiency is efficiency pays for itself. And, so far we have not found the BE measures in enough scale to hit the targets that pay for themselves. And so there absolutely is going to be a cost impact to customers.
Yeah, and there's also a timing of when that extra revenue is coming in. If you're electrifying, you're getting more kilowatt hours, but that's spread over the life of the measure. And so there's I would encourage all the regulators out there to just take the time to do the math of like, what does this look like if we put it in O&M? What does it look like if we rate base it? And how's the time flow of money kind of working in those?
And how does it build versus if it's concurrent recovery, there's less of the potential for maybe a hangover or whatever you want to call it, out in future years. And the other piece I would add is, currently we have very high gas prices relative to, they're very low relative to electricity. They're very high relative to 2 years ago. And so customers are already feeling a huge increase in their bill. Is this the time to, add additional there? So it's a very complicated issue.
Yeah, for sure. We're all going to be getting lots of happy phone calls and angry phone calls. Okay, so we could probably brain about that forever, but I would very much like to introduce our next speaker, Anthony Fryer, who's coming to us from Minnesota, which is kind of really got a lot of interesting programs in the decarbonization space going on. So I'm excited to hear from him. So he is the DER Conservation Improvement Supervisor at the Minnesota Department of Commerce. And just to clarify for those who don't know, in Minnesota, the Department of Commerce is actually the state energy office. You can think of him as like an SEO kind of person. And he provides a lot of oversight and regulation for natural gas, demand side management, in addition to energy efficiency efforts. So with that, I will just turn it over to Anthony and we will go from there.
Great. Thanks, Joan. And good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to be here, and thanks to Nayruk for convening this panel today. As Joan mentioned, I'm Anthony Fryer. I supervise the Conservation Improvement Program for the Minnesota Department of Commerce. And our Conservation Improvement Program is sort of broken down into two roles that the Department of Commerce plays. The first is the regulation of that program. We have about 120 electric and natural gas utilities that are required to participate in the Conservation Improvement Program. And that means that they have a energy savings goal that they're required to meet each year. And so we provide regulatory oversight for that activity to ensure that the utilities are meeting all the statutory requirements that they are required to meet. And then on the other side, we provide technical assistance for those utilities to help them actually meet those goals. And that comes through the development of our technical reference manual. We have a card grant program that funds about $2 million in related research each year, and also an energy savings platform that allows for this, large number of utilities to provide data to us in a sort of centralized place. So the Minnesota Energy Conservation and Optimization Act that passed last year is new legislation that sort of modernizes the Conservation Improvement Program, or SIP as we refer to it as. And the interesting part of, there's many interesting parts about the act, but one of the most interesting is that it now provides a pathway for electric utilities and natural gas utilities participating in SIP to pursue electrification efforts, and I'll provide more detail on that as we go through the slides. Next slide. Just an overview of what I'll cover, provide a brief SIP overview, and then really talk in some detail about the development of ECO and some of the changes that are brought about by it. And then finally, I'll hit briefly on the Natural Gas Innovation Act, which was also signed into law at the same time as ECO, and has some, I think, interesting electrification and other other efforts or opportunities embedded in it as well. Next slide. So here are just some sort of high-level energy policy goals for the state of Minnesota that drive a lot of the work that we do on the efficiency front. Greenhouse gas emission reduction goal of 30% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. We have a renewable energy standard, a goal that 25% of electric utilities total retail sales will be met by renewable energy resources by 2025. And then finally, that energy efficiency resource standard, which the Conservation Improvement Program is the sort of implementation program of. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a breakdown of the sort of Minnesota utility network. We have over 200 utilities in all. I think it was about 210 was the last number that I heard. On the electric side, we have 3 investor-owned utilities, about 40 plus cooperative utilities, and then over 100 municipal utilities. And then on the natural gas side, we have 11 gas utilities in all, and 5 of those are IOUs, and the remaining 6 are municipal utilities. And so just I guess an important note with the Conservation Improvement Program. Obviously, we're talking primarily electrification today, and the ECO Act helps facilitate that through our SIP program. But this is primarily an efficiency first program, and it, as I've mentioned, does involve electric utilities and natural gas utilities as well that have savings goals to meet. Next slide. Just some of the achievements of SIP to date. We are, or Minnesota as a whole, and SIP as a part of that, have achieved a top 10 ranking in the ACEEE scorecard for over a decade now, and are often the highest ranked state in the Midwest. So that's something that we're certainly very proud of. And then just a few of the achievements on the right hand side here in terms of $6 billion in savings over the last 20 years, 47,000 jobs in the efficiency related fields, hopefully helping to keep rates low. And according to economic analysis that we commissioned, SIP generates about $4 in benefits for Minnesota for every dollar that is invested. Next slide. And this is just some legislative language that really drives a lot of what we do in Minnesota in terms of energy efficiency, and certainly through the SIP program, that the legislature finds that energy savings are an energy resource, and that cost-effective energy savings are preferred over all other energy resources. That the legislature finds that cost-effective energy savings and load management programs should be procured systematically and aggressively. Next slide. And this graph just, I think, illustrates why Minnesota is so focused and enthusiastic on efficiency efforts. That a megawatt hour saved in SIP is still very cost effective and compares very favorably to other electric generation sources. Next slide. And then this is just some of the SIP performance for the electric and natural gas utilities over the last decade. And in 2010 was when we first had an actual energy savings goal. There was many iterations of SIP prior to that, but in 2010, we switched over to an energy savings goal of 1.5%. And that really has been eclipsed, certainly by the electric utilities over the years. And some of our IOUs are now coming in at sort of 3 or 4% of energy savings related to retail sales on an annual basis. The natural gas utilities, I think, similar to natural gas utilities in other parts of the country, it's more of a struggle to meet that 1.5%, just with the nature of natural gas efficiency. But our natural gas utilities have certainly, I think, performed very well over the years and have reached 1.5% in some cases, but almost always achieve over 1%. And back to the ACEEE scorecard, which we like to refer to a lot, compared to other states, our natural gas savings are some of the best in the country. Next slide. So with the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act, or ECO, this was signed into law in the spring of last year, and it was the result of multiple years of discussion and development, which I'll detail a little bit more in coming slides. And what it does is it primarily modernizes the SIP framework to provide a more holistic approach to efficiency programming. It essentially removed a fuel switching prohibition that we had in place since 2005. It allowed for load management programs to be included in SIP, which they were before, but under sort of restricted circumstances. Now the threshold for load management programs to be included is that they be cost effective. And so that's what the utility has to demonstrate now. Next slide. So prior to ECO passing, as with any major legislation, there were a number of very important steps that took place to enable its eventual passage in 2021. The first that we saw of this was in I would say sort of 2017, 2018, initially a small group of stakeholders convened to determine possible areas of change to SIP. And a lot of that was being driven by the sort of emergence of electrification in the efficiency sort of conversation, and stakeholders wanting to relook at the fuel switching prohibition to see if that is something that should be removed, and if so, what should be put in its place if utilities want to electrify, what parameters should be included in that. Because certainly for SIP, I think that there's a lot of pride, not only from the state of Minnesota, but I think SIP stakeholders, utilities, and others, that it's been a very effective efficiency program over the years. And if there is to be this electrification element included, that it be done in a way that doesn't detract or doesn't sort of erode the progress that has been made sort of over the last decade or so. So once areas of agreement were reached between this smaller group, we then convened a broader stakeholder group to develop specifics relating to energy savings goals, low income requirements, fuel switching, load management, and other areas as well. A lot of this was convened and driven by the Center for Energy and Environment, or CEE, which is a Minneapolis-based energy group. And that is what sort of the point at which that information, all of those ideas were taken to the legislature. It did not pass first time. It was introduced in 2019, introduced again in 2020, and then finally passed in 2021 in a bipartisan manner, which is the only way it could pass. We have a divided legislature in Minnesota with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. So it really was, I think, a landmark legislative achievement for many reasons. The next slide. While the legislation was being developed, what we decided to do at the Department of Commerce was to try and increase our own knowledge around electrification and that of our stakeholders as well. As it was obviously a very sort of new concept at the time, and was one that we certainly wanted to know more about as the electrification conversation and the legislation started to progress. So we commissioned a white paper to provide an electrification overview for Minnesota in 2018. We had a number of fuel switching stakeholder discussions to determine if that fuel switching prohibition should be removed. We also received US Department of Energy funding to have electrification stakeholder engagement process, and then through the CARD grant process that I mentioned earlier, we have funded a lot of related electrification research into air source heat pumps and other things like that. Next slide. So highlights of ECO, it allows utilities to include load management programs, efficient fuel switching programs. It raises the energy savings goal for the state's electric IOUs, more than doubles the low income spending requirement for all IOUs, and includes that activities to improve efficiency for public schools as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So here are just some of the numbers. I'm just going to focus here on the spending. Until July 1st, 2026, spending on fuel switching improvements as part of SIP must not exceed 0.35% per year. So there's this initial sort of spending cap around fuel switching until 2026. After that, utilities are given more flexibility to include those programs in their SIP portfolios. One thing to note is that the savings associated with fuel switching can only be included after they reach the 1.75%, and even then, those savings are not will not be included in the utilities financial incentive calculation that we have in Minnesota. So those are some of the restrictions around that. Next slide. And then on the natural gas side, there's again in that total spending line, there's a restriction on fuel switching improvements. And what ECO allows for the natural gas investor-owned utilities is to create programs that encourage a switch from a natural gas end use to an electric end use. And the benefits to the gas utility of doing that are twofold. First of all, those savings can be counted towards that 1% energy savings goal. And then also the net benefits from those efforts can be included in the financial incentive calculation as well. So the natural gas investor-owned utilities also have this electrification opportunity as well. Next slide. So once ECO passed, there was a lot of information in there that required the Department of Commerce to issue technical guidance And we did that for multifamily buildings, for electric vehicle charging cells, and then for efficient fuel switching as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is just an outline of the stakeholder engagement process that we conducted to develop the technical guidance. Next slide. And then this is how we broke down that stakeholder engagement into various sort of topic-specific groups that then fed recommendations back up to a coordinating committee, which then provided those recommendations to the Department of Commerce, and then our commissioner issued the final technical guidance on March 15th. Next slide. So this is the efficient fuel switching criteria that was developed in the legislation. For a fuel switching improvement to be included in SIP, has to reduce the amount of source energy consumed compared to what it's being displaced. Has to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions over the lifetime of improvement, has to be cost effective from a variety of perspectives, and then has to be installed and operated in a manner that improves the utility system load factor. Most of our technical guidance that we issued involved efficient fuel switching and specifically the methodology for greenhouse gas emissions calculations and source energy as well. And I'm happy to provide a link to that decision with all of the details in it to anyone that wants to take a look at that. Next slide. So as I mentioned, load management programs can now be included in SIP provided that they are cost effective. Next slide. And then Minnesota IOUs submit plans on a 3-year basis. We're currently between 2021 and 2023. So the next triennial 2024 through 26 is likely to represent the first significant introduction of efficient fuel switching programs and load management programs into SIP. Next slide. And these are just some of the next steps that we're going to be taking, modifying our technical reference manual, modifying cost effectiveness assumptions, like Dan mentioned, low-income stakeholder meetings to determine equity needs around the new opportunities with ECO, and then also continuing to identify research needs and funding those through our card grant process. Next slide. So the Natural Gas Innovation Act, and I'm sort of hitting on the end of my time here, but very briefly, it provides natural gas utilities a regulatory pathway for achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions through alternative non-natural gas resources. And this includes energy efficiency, strategic electrification, and those other listed opportunities as well. And I'll just end by saying that the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission is due to file or release the greenhouse gas emissions and cost effectiveness assessment frameworks next week, which will provide obviously the framework for those natural gas utilities wanting to implement what would be 5-year plans, the first of which we're expecting to be filed in later this year or early next year. Next slide. And we can skip to the next slide. And that is it. Thank you again for your time. Happy to take questions or the discussion with the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. I really appreciate it. And I just had one follow-up. You mentioned a requirement of kind of the electrification measures is that they're installed and operated to improve your system load factor. And I had never seen a requirement like that. And I just wondered if you could give us a super brief overview of which measures are actually meeting that requirement, because that seemed like you'd have to take a deep dive in your technical reference manual to actually figure out that question.
Yeah, and as with many of these elements of ECO, that's something that we're still sort of working on the methodology for. And what we've asked utilities to do is those that would like to file efficient fuel switching related programs before next version of the TRM and cost effectiveness methodologies are finalized. They can do so on a custom basis, meaning that they explain to us how they've sort of met that threshold. But that was, yeah, that was one that definitely caused us to sort of scratch our chins a little bit once it sort of been signed into law, as to how do we actually demonstrate that, or how does the utility demonstrate that?
Right. Yeah. It seems like, okay, in 10 years or 15 years, when we've really ironed out all the kinks in two-way DU communication and direct load management and all that, that might be a little more achievable, but it's hard to tell a customer, like, install a heat pump. And by the way, you can only run it during these non-peak hours and you're in charge of doing that somehow. So anyway, it's just a sticky wicket, but I appreciate you addressing it. So what I'm going to do now is bring back up our other panelists. So we've got Edward, Dan, and Mark. If you could turn your cameras on, and we are just going to have a few minutes for some kind of panel discussion. And I'm going to kick it off with a question that has been kicking around in Vermont, and I'm very curious what your take on it is. A study was done recently by UVM that Black and Brown people are 7 times less likely to be enrolled in or benefit from any of our clean energy programs. So that includes electrification and efficiency that we're talking about here, but it also includes net metering, et cetera, et cetera. And so each of the presenters kind of touched on low income, but I think it's really important because energy is such a historically racialized structure, as in all of the worst stuff is cited in BIPOC areas, and all of the benefits, kind of, not all of, but many of the benefits end up piling up for affluent white people. How are we thinking about beneficial electrification in the context of, revolutionizing the energy system, not just to decarbonize, but also to create greater equity among, across kind of those demographic lines. So I guess maybe first I'll pitch that to Dan and Edward from ACEEE, because they have a little more experience, and feel free to punt if it's a question mark.
Go ahead, Edward. Sorry.
Would you like me to go first? No,
Sure.
Broadly, though, one thing that, certainly an excellent question, by the way. So yeah, thank you for addressing that. And I think I'll just speak more personally from my previous role as the energy policy advisor with the DC government, rather than sort of ACEEE, because I think and I'll ask Dan to address sort of ACEEE perspective. In terms of making sure that people receive the benefits of it, sort of a decarbonization and electrification efforts, my personal experience in doing outreach with low-income community folks is that they asked us gave us a sensible request, which is that they certainly want to make sure that they receive the benefits. But that we come to them when our ducks are in a row, and when we know that we have figured out all the things that we need to do, and essentially we know what we're doing. We have addressed the barriers of red tapes. We have really streamlined the process. Once we have figured that out, please then come to us and make sure we're the first in line to get the benefits of that. But don't come to us if those things aren't ready. Like, we are not interested in being the guinea pig. Like, don't problem solve through us. That was what their message was. They certainly don't want to be the last to go. But sometimes I think what the message that my former colleagues and I received was that don't just sort of, we appreciate that you guys are reaching out to us, but just don't confuse that with always thinking that we have to be the first one to be receiving the latest, the best technology. But just once we have it streamlined, once the costs are really good, come to us and give it to us in an easy way. So that's one thing I'll say.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that is, I think in our work looking at decarbonization for affordable housing, I think there's very wide recognition that this is important. It yields some really important benefits to low-income communities, underserved, under-resourced communities. That there's definitely some safety benefits, health and safety, from improved indoor air quality and not having combustion sources in the house and things like that. So those are very clear benefits. it gets tricky figuring out the costs, especially how to cover those costs, since the homeowners aren't likely to have the money to invest in more expensive equipment. So I think as we observed it, I think some of the existing programs are going to be adding technologies into that to serve it. And then just a final quick point is just that there certainly are areas of affordable housing where electrification can just go full throttle ahead, and that tends to be existing apartment buildings with electric resistance heating and really poor window air conditioning units. So, they're putting in heat pumps, mini splits would almost certainly be a benefit. And also new construction is another area where we're building new housing that's affordable. It can be electrified from the get-go. And so let's get those going first, and then to tackle those more difficult problems of funding and then existing building problems that have to be addressed first.
Great. Okay, so I think we are just about at time. I don't know, Danielle, if we have a couple more minutes to maybe give Anthony and Mark a chance to take a crack at that question, how they're thinking about race and clean energy, but that's a doozy. So, Danielle, I don't know if we can go a minute or two over.
If you'd like to answer the question, please go right ahead.
Okay.
I guess I would echo a lot of what Dan said. And the thing I would add is that we don't have the answers yet. We have multiple pilots going on with different approaches to try to understand, how to really take advantage of some of those health and safety benefits, and to use some flexibility we have under our existing energy efficiency programs to address some of those, and bring that all together and do it in a way that long-term has similar energy burden help that our existing energy efficiency programs have. We don't have the answer yet, but we have a few different, like I said, a few different pilots in place, and I think we're gonna have to learn along the way. There's definitely room for growth there.
Great. And then last, we'll go to Anthony if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in Minnesota over the last 2 years, with our current administration, equity issues have been sort of front and center, and that's been sort of demonstrated with cabinet appointments within the Department of Commerce and other agencies as well. In terms of the conservation improvement program specifically, a real sort of threshold question for eco-passing was a significant increase in low-income spending, which came about. It more than doubles for natural gas utilities, and about the same for electric as well. Then a couple of other things that we're doing, that we do sort of waive the cost effectiveness requirement for low-income programs to provide utilities with more flexibility to design and implement those. And one thing we're also looking at in Minnesota is a financial incentive for the utility for low-income programming. Currently, it's sort of off to the side, and so that is something that's within the purview of our Public Utilities Commission, but something that the Department of Commerce is discussing with other stakeholders to see if that is something that can also increase low-income programming beyond what it is currently at.
Wonderful. Okay, and with that, we are about out of time. I just wanted to say a deep and true thank you to Danielle and all the folks at NARUC for organizing, and also to our speakers. I can't tell you how valuable it is to just get the perspective of different states and different stakeholders. It really helps move the ball forward when we can share learning on this topic, which is so important for decarbonization, for equity, and for all of our future. So again, thank you all so much. And up on the screen, you'll see Danielle's posted some upcoming events. Please check those out. And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank